In 1878, Emma Wilson stepped off the train in Pine Ridge, Wyoming Territory, with nothing but a weathered trunk and fading hope. The grueling 3-day journey from Philadelphia had left her exhausted, but it was the weight of expectations that truly burdened her shoulders. She had traveled over 1,800 miles to marry a man she knew only through letters, a man who would soon prove those carefully penned promises weren't worth the paper they were written on. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. As Emma stood on the platform, clutching the telegram that had sealed her fate, she watched for the face she'd memorized from a small tin-type photograph. In a time when women had precious few options to secure their futures, she had chosen what seemed the most practical path. Now, 26 years old, and with no family remaining, becoming a mail-order bride to a Wyoming shopkeeper had offered the promise of security, if not love. What Emma couldn't have known was that fate had a different plan entirely, one that would begin with rejection but lead to a connection deeper than words could express. This is the story of how a woman who barely spoke found her voice in the most unexpected place, with a man who couldn't hear. The April wind whipped across the railway platform, carrying the acrid smell of coal smoke as Emma tucked a loose strand of chestnut hair back beneath her bonnet. Her grey traveling dress, once considered fashionable in Philadelphia, suddenly seemed woefully out of place among the practical clothes of the frontier women she'd observed during her journey west. Emma's gloved fingers traced the edges of the letter in her pocket, the last of 12, exchanged with Harold Barton over 6 months. A successful general store owner with political aspirations, Harold had described Pine Ridge as a booming settlement with a promising future in Wyoming Territory. He sought a refined Eastern lady with good business sense to help manage his store and enhance his standing in the community. Emma, with her experience keeping books for her late father's printing business, had seemed the perfect match. What neither of her carefully composed letters mentioned was that diphtheria had not only claimed her parents 2 years prior, but had also damaged her vocal cords, leaving her with little more than a hoarse whisper when she could speak at all. Some days, no sound emerged whatsoever, no matter how she strained. "Miss Wilson?" A sharp voice cut through her thoughts. Emma turned to see a stout man in a tailored suit approaching, his eyes darting between her face and a folded paper in his hand. Harold Barton was shorter than she had imagined, with a receding hairline and an impressive mustache that seemed to compensate for it. His clothes were of good quality, if a touch too formal for the dusty frontier town. Emma nodded, attempting a smile. She had rehearsed this moment countless times during the long journey, preparing herself to make the best possible first impression, despite her limitations. "Welcome to Pine Ridge," Harold said, making no move to assist with her trunk. "I trust your journey was satisfactory." Emma opened her mouth to respond, but only a raspy whisper emerged. "Yes, thank you," she managed, the words barely audible above the hissing of the train's cooling engine. Harold's eyebrows shot up. "I beg your pardon? Is something the matter with your voice?" Heat flooded Emma's cheeks as she reached into her handbag and withdrew a small slate and chalk, constant companions since her illness. She quickly wrote, "My voice was damaged by illness. I can speak, but with great difficulty." Harold read the slate, his frown deepening with each word. "This is unexpected," he said, taking a step back as though her condition might be contagious. "You made no mention of this impediment in your letters." Emma hastily wiped the slate clean and wrote again, "I express myself better in writing. I didn't think it would matter greatly." "Not matter?" Harold scoffed. "Miss Wilson, I run the most prominent establishment in Pine Ridge. My customers expect to be greeted properly, to engage in conversation about their purchases and the town's affairs." I'm also planning to run for territorial representative next year. How would it look to have a wife who cannot speak at social functions? Emma felt as though the ground beneath her feet had suddenly shifted. She had expected some period of adjustment, perhaps even disappointment at her plain appearance, but not this immediate rejection of her very person. She wrote again, her chalk nearly snapping with the pressure. I can work hard. I have experience with bookkeeping and inventory. Harold barely glanced at her words. I advertised for a wife, Miss Wilson, not a silent shopkeeper. This arrangement simply will not suit. The curious stares of passengers and townspeople burned into Emma as she stood frozen on the platform, humiliation washing over her in waves. 6 days of travel, nearly all her savings spent on the journey, and now she faced abandonment before even leaving the station. The westbound train leaves tomorrow at noon, Harold said, already turning away. I suggest you be on it. Good day, Miss Wilson. Emma stood motionless, the slate clutched in white-knuckled fingers as Harold Barton walked briskly back toward the town, never once looking back. A lump formed in her throat, but years of inability to cry out had taught her to swallow such emotions, at least in public. Well, that's Harold Barton for you, a voice said from behind, startling Emma from her shocked stupor. Never met a man whose opinion of himself was quite so inflated. Emma turned to find an older woman with silver-streaked auburn hair pulled into a practical bun. Despite the harshness of her words, her hazel eyes held kindness. I'm Clara Jenkins, the woman said. I run the boarding house just off Main Street. She nodded toward Emma's trunk. Looks like you might be needing a place to stay tonight. Emma nodded gratefully and quickly wrote on her slate. Thank you. I'm Emma Wilson. Clara glanced at the slate but didn't comment on it. Instead, she called to a gangly boy lounging near the station. Billy, 2 bits to carry this lady's trunk to my place. As they walked down Pine Ridge's main thoroughfare, Clara provided a running commentary that required no response from Emma. The town was larger than Emma had expected, with several solid buildings of brick and stone interspersed among the more common wooden structures. Barton's general store occupied a prominent corner location, its large windows displaying everything from tools to fabric. Mining brought the first wave of folks, Clara explained. Then the railway last year. Now we've got nearly 500. Souls calling Pine Ridge home, and more arriving each month. Emma nodded, taking in the busy streets and the mix of people. Miners with their distinctive gait, cowboys in their practical gear, proper-looking townswomen, and a few Native Americans on the outskirts of the activity. Harold Barton's brought 2 mail-order brides to Pine Ridge before you, Clara continued, lowering her voice. Neither stayed more than a fortnight. The man has expectations higher than the Grand Tetons and the character of a sidewinder. Emma's eyebrows rose in surprise at this revelation. She wasn't the first to be rejected then. Somehow, this knowledge lessened the sting slightly. The boarding house was a well-maintained 2-story building with a wide porch and curtained windows. Inside, the smell of baking bread and coffee created an immediately welcoming atmosphere. Clara showed Emma to a small but clean room on the 2nd floor. Supper's at 6, she said. Rest now. Tomorrow's soon enough to figure out your next steps. Alone in the room, Emma finally allowed her composure to crack. She sank onto the narrow bed and buried her face in her hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She had gambled everything on this fresh start, selling most of her possessions to afford the journey. Now she was stranded in a frontier town with barely enough money for a return ticket and nothing to return to. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when Emma awoke the next morning. Having cried herself to sleep fully dressed, she rose stiffly and moved to the washstand. The face that looked back from the small mirror appeared older than her 26 years, with shadows beneath her brown eyes and tension in the corners of her mouth. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She had spent half the night weighing her options. She could return east on the noon train, but to what? Their modest Philadelphia home had been sold to pay her father's medical debts. The few distant relatives she had made it clear they couldn't take on another mouth to feed. The printing business, once thriving, had been sold for a fraction of its worth after her father's death. Or she could stay in Pine Ridge, at least temporarily. Her funds would cover perhaps 2 weeks at Mrs. Jenkins' boarding house. In that time, could she find work sufficient to support herself? It seemed a daunting prospect in a town where she knew no one and couldn't even properly introduce herself. Emma dressed carefully in her second-best dress, a navy blue wool with minimal ornamentation, and pinned her hair in a simple style. If she was to seek employment today, she must look respectable, but not above practical work. The boarding house dining room was already bustling when Emma descended the stairs. Clara efficiently introduced her to the other boarders, 2 school teachers. Sharing a room, an older gentleman who worked as the town clerk, and a young widow who ran a small bakery. "This is Miss Wilson," Clara explained simply. "She's just arrived from Philadelphia and will be staying with us for a time." Emma nodded politely, relieved when Clara made no mention of her failed engagement or her speech impediment. The other diners welcomed her warmly, seemingly unsurprised by a new arrival. "Philadelphia," remarked the older of the 2 school teachers, Miss Gardner. "We're desperate for educated people in Pine Ridge. The school board just approved funding for additional teaching positions as the town grows." Emma smiled, but felt a pang of regret. Teaching would have been an ideal position, but how could she possibly manage a classroom when she couldn't project her voice? "Are you planning to stay in Pine Ridge?" asked Mrs. Collins, the young widow, passing a plate of biscuits. Emma hesitated, then withdrew her slate from her pocket. She wrote quickly, "I hope to find work here if possible. I have experience with bookkeeping and sewing." The table fell silent as the diners read her words. Emma braced herself for the usual reactions: pity, discomfort, awkward questions about her condition. Instead, Mrs. Collins simply nodded. Margaret Foster at the dressmaker's shop was just saying yesterday she's swamped with orders for spring wardrobes. The mining manager's wife has all the ladies competing for the finest gowns for next month's spring festival. And Barton's store needs a bookkeeper who can count past 10 without using their fingers, added Mr. Peterson, the town clerk, with a snort. "Though I wouldn't recommend working for that blowhard." Emma blinked in surprise at their matter-of-fact acceptance. She wrote again, "Thank you for the suggestions. I'll inquire at the dressmaker's shop this morning." After breakfast, Emma set out with directions to Foster's dressmaking. The shop was located on a side street off the main thoroughfare, its windows displaying a fashionable day dress and several fabric samples. A bell tinkled as Emma entered the small but well-organized space. A harried-looking woman in her 50s glanced up from a cutting table at the back. "Be with you in a moment," she called, pins held between her lips as she marked a pattern on dark blue fabric. Emma waited patiently, taking in the bolts of fabric lining the walls and the half-finished garments on dressmakers' forms. The shop showed signs of prosperity. Good quality materials and the latest fashion plates from St. Louis and even New York displayed on a small table. After securing the last pin, the woman approached the counter. "Margaret Foster," she introduced herself briskly. "How can I help you today? If you're looking for a fitting, I'm afraid I'm scheduled solid for the week." Emma quickly wrote on her slate, "My name is Emma Wilson, Mrs. Collins from the bakery. Suggested I inquire if you need assistance with sewing. I have experience with fine needlework." Margaret's eyebrows rose as she read the slate, but like the boarders at breakfast, she seemed more interested in Emma's skills than her method of communication. "Can you do French seams, proper buttonholes, beadwork?" she asked. Emma nodded, firmly to each question. "Let me see your hands," Margaret requested. Emma removed her gloves and extended her hands for inspection. Margaret took them, turning them over to examine both sides. Emma's hands told the story her voice could not. The slight callus on her middle finger from years of holding a pen for her father's bookkeeping, the tiny scars from pinpricks, the strength in her fingers from operating a heavy press when needed. "Wait here," Margaret said, disappearing into the back room. She returned with a piece of fine lawn fabric and a needle already threaded with silk. "Show me a buttonhole stitch." For the next 10 minutes, Emma demonstrated various stitches and techniques while Margaret watched with a critical eye. Finally, satisfied, the dressmaker nodded. "I've more orders than I can handle," she admitted. "Spring festival is in 4 weeks, and every woman in town suddenly needs a new gown. I could use an extra pair of hands, at least through the festival season." Emma wrote quickly. What would the position pay? They negotiated briefly, settling on a wage that would cover Emma's room and board at Clara's with a small amount left over. It wasn't much, but it would buy her time to establish herself in Pine Ridge and consider her longer-term options. "You can start today," Margaret said. "There's a workroom in the back with good light. We open at 8 and close at 6 with Sundays off." By evening, Emma's back ached from hours bent over fine stitching, but a sense of accomplishment had replaced some of the previous day's despair. The work was familiar and soothing in its precision. Margaret, while brusque, was fair and seemed unbothered by Emma's silence, even commenting that it allowed better concentration on their work. As Emma walked back to the boarding house in the fading light, she passed Barton's general store. Through the large windows, she could see Harold behind the counter, engaged in animated conversation with a well-dressed man. Their gazes happened to meet, and Harold's face darkened with recognition before he deliberately turned away. Emma squared her shoulders and continued walking. She had survived worse than a man's wounded pride. For today, at least, she had secured a foothold in Pine Ridge. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The next 3 weeks fell into a predictable rhythm. Emma rose early, broke fast with the other boarders, and spent her days at Foster's dressmaking. The work was demanding but satisfying, and Margaret increasingly trusted her with more complex tasks as her skill became evident. Word spread quietly through the feminine networks of Pine Ridge about the new seamstress with the gifted hands and silent demeanor. Several of Margaret's customers specifically requested Emma's work on their garments, particularly for fine details and embellishments. "Mrs. Henderson couldn't stop raving about the beadwork you did on her bodice," Margaret informed Emma one afternoon. "Said it was finer than anything she'd seen in Denver." Emma smiled, pleased by the compliment, but even more gratified by the growing sense that she might actually build a life here. Her slate and chalk remained constant companions, but many of the regular customers had grown accustomed to her written communications, some even learning to phrase questions that required only nods or simple gestures in response. It was during her 4th week in Pine Ridge that everything changed. Emma was alone in the shop, Margaret having gone to deliver a completed gown, when the bell above the door announced a customer. She looked up to see a tall man in his early 30s with broad shoulders and work-roughened hands entering the shop. His clothes, while clean and well-maintained, showed signs of hard use, the practical attire of a working man rather than a townsman. His light brown hair was slightly too long, curling at the collar, and a few days' worth of stubble shadowed his strong jaw. Most striking, however, were his eyes, a clear, penetrating blue that seemed to take in everything around him with unusual intensity. Emma rose from her work table and nodded in greeting. The man didn't respond to her gesture, instead looking intently at her face. Slightly unnerved by his scrutiny, she reached for her slate and wrote, "How may I help you?" The man's expression shifted to one of confusion as he continued to stare. Then, to Emma's astonishment, his hands began to move in deliberate gestures, his fingers forming patterns she didn't recognize. When she didn't respond, he frowned and pointed to the tear on the sleeve of his jacket. Understanding dawned on Emma with sudden clarity. The man wasn't being rude, he was deaf. She pointed to the tear and nodded, then gestured for him to remove the jacket. He did so without hesitation, revealing a faded blue shirt beneath. As she examined the torn fabric, she felt the weight of his gaze, but found it didn't disturb her, as the stares of others often did. The repair was simple, just a split seam that would take only a few minutes to mend. Emma efficiently threaded a needle and began to stitch, aware of the man watching her hands with obvious appreciation for her skill. When she finished, she handed the jacket back to him. He inspected her work with careful fingers before nodding in approval. From his pocket, he withdrew a few coins, but Emma shook her head and wrote on her slate, "No charge for such a small repair." The man frowned, clearly unwilling to accept charity. He placed the coins on the counter firmly. Then, to Emma's surprise, he pulled a small notebook and pencil from his pocket. He wrote in a surprisingly elegant hand, "James Cooper, Ranch North." Of town. Emma smiled and wrote her own name on the slate. James studied her face intently, then wrote in his notebook again, "You don't speak?" The directness of the question might have offended her from another person, but there was no judgment in his expression, only straightforward curiosity. She wrote, "Illness damaged my voice. I can speak, but only in whispers, and some days not at all." James read her words, then looked up. The expression that crossed his face hit Emma like a physical force. There was no pity in his eyes, only recognition, the gaze of someone who understood what it meant to navigate a world designed for others. He wrote again, "I was born without hearing, never heard a sound." Emma nodded, a strange sense of kinship blooming in her chest. Here was someone who understood isolation not as an abstract concept, but as a daily reality. Before either could write more, the shop door opened and Margaret returned, accompanied by none other than Harold Barton. Emma tensed as Harold stopped short at the sight of James. "Cooper," Harold said curtly, then turned to Emma with barely concealed disdain. "Miss Wilson, I see you found employment. How suitable." James, unaware of the spoken exchange, continued putting on his jacket. Harold stepped closer to Emma, lowering his voice. "I hope you're not encouraging the company of James Cooper," he said. "The man may be a skilled rancher, but he's hardly fit for proper society. Then again, perhaps that's why you find him appealing. Birds of a feather, as they say." The cruel insinuation sent a flush of anger through Emma. She gripped her slate and wrote in large, clear letters, "Mr. Cooper has been nothing but courteous, unlike others I could name." Harold's face reddened as he read her words. "I see you found a kindred spirit in our local oddity. How fitting." James, watching their faces intently, seemed to sense the tension. He straightened to his full height, a good 6 inches taller than Harold, and fixed the storekeeper with a level stare that made the smaller man take a step back. Margaret cleared her throat pointedly. "Mr. Barton, did you need something from my shop, or are you just here to disturb my assistant?" Harold adjusted his waistcoat with a huff. "I came to inform you that my new shipment of dress goods has arrived from St. Louis. I thought you might want to examine them before I make them available to the general public." "I'll stop by tomorrow," Margaret said coolly. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we have orders to complete." After Harold departed, Margaret turned to Emma with concern. "Are you all right? That man has the manners of a wild boar and half the charm." Emma nodded, embarrassed by the confrontation, but appreciative of Margaret's support. She glanced at James, who was watching them closely, trying to follow the exchange through their expressions. There was something in his steady gaze that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't experienced since arriving in Pine Ridge. James pulled out his notebook again and wrote, "Sunday, my ranch. I'll send a wagon at 10 if you want to come." The unexpected invitation startled Emma. She looked at James questioningly, but his expression remained earnest, awaiting her answer. After a moment's hesitation, she wrote on her slate, "Yes, thank you." The smile that spread across James's face transformed his features, softening the weathered lines and lighting his blue eyes with warmth. He nodded once more to both women, then departed the shop. "Well," Margaret said, watching him go, "that's interesting." Emma gave her a questioning look. "James Cooper keeps to himself mostly," Margaret explained. "Comes to town for supplies about once a month. His father left him that ranch 5 years ago, and he's turned it into one of the most productive in the county, despite what folks like. Harold Barton might say." She paused, studying Emma. "He's never invited anyone out to his place that I've heard tell of, not even for business." Emma felt a warmth creep into her cheeks. "Be careful, though," Margaret added more seriously. "Not because of James, he's as honorable as they come, but people here aren't always kind about those they see as different. A deaf rancher and a woman who doesn't speak?" She shook her head. "There'll be talk." Emma considered this, then wrote firmly, "Let them talk. I've heard worse in Philadelphia drawing rooms." Sunday morning dawned clear and cool, with the promise of spring in the fresh breeze. Emma dressed with particular care in her best day dress, a forest green poplin with subtle embroidery at the collar and cuffs. She had spent Saturday evening altering it to better suit the Western style she'd observed among Pine Ridge women, removing some of the more elaborate Eastern trimmings, as she pinned her hair in a simpler style than her usual Eastern coiffure. Emma tried to quiet the nervous flutter in her stomach. It had been years since she'd accepted a social invitation from a man, not since before her illness, when she'd been briefly courted by the son of a business associate of her father's. That courtship had ended abruptly when her voice failed, the young man retreating with barely disguised relief and poorly concealed revulsion. James Cooper showed no such revulsion at her condition. Indeed, he seemed to understand her situation with a depth that others couldn't possibly achieve. Still, his invitation surprised her. What could a frontier rancher possibly want with a displaced Eastern spinster who couldn't even hold a proper conversation? "You look lovely," Clara commented when Emma descended to the parlor to wait. "Though I still think this outing is hasty. You barely know James Cooper." Emma pulled out her slate. "I feel comfortable with him. We understand each other." Clara sighed. "That may be so, but remember his ranch is 6 miles outside town. His nearest neighbor is a good distance away, and if you needed help." Emma frowned and wrote, "His deafness doesn't make him dangerous." "Of course not," Clara backpedaled. "James is well respected for his ranching skills, but he's been alone since his father died. People who live in isolation can develop peculiarities." A wagon appeared on the street outside, interrupting their conversation. Emma's heart quickened as she recognized James handling the reins of a well-maintained wagon drawn by 2 matching bay horses. What struck her immediately was his transformation from their first meeting. Gone were the working clothes. Today, he wore clean dark trousers under a crisp white shirt with a leather vest. His hair had been neatly trimmed, and his face was freshly shaved. Clara followed Emma onto the porch. "Mr. Cooper," she called loudly, then caught herself with an embarrassed look and simply nodded instead. James returned the nod politely, then turned his attention to Emma. From behind the wagon seat, he produced a small bouquet of early spring wildflowers, offering them with a formal gesture that seemed practiced, as though he'd rehearsed this moment. Emma accepted them with a genuine smile, inhaling their delicate fragrance. James pointed to the wagon seat, raising his eyebrows in question. She nodded, and he helped her up beside him. "Have her back before dark," Clara instructed, with exaggerated hand movements. James nodded solemnly before climbing up beside Emma. As they pulled away, Emma realized she was embarking on the most unusual social call of her life, with a man she couldn't speak to a destination she'd never seen, in a territory still largely wild and unknown to her. Yet somehow, despite these obstacles, or perhaps because of them, she felt a sense of anticipation and freedom that had eluded her since long before she boarded the train to Wyoming. As the wagon rattled along the rutted trail leading away, from Pine Ridge, Emma watched the town gradually fade behind them, first the buildings disappearing, then the smoke from chimneys, until only the church steeple remained visible against the vast Wyoming sky. The landscape opened before them, rolling prairie dotted with sagebrush and occasional stands of cottonwood along the meandering creeks. Beside her, James handled the reins with confident ease, occasionally glancing her way as if to ensure she was comfortable. The silence between them felt natural rather than awkward, a shared quietude that required no filling. Still, Emma found herself wishing she knew the hand language James had attempted to use in the shop. How remarkable it would be to communicate without slate or paper. After about an hour's journey, James guided the wagon around a bend in the trail, and his ranch came into view. Nestled in a protected valley with a creek flowing through it, the property appeared well established and meticulously maintained. A sturdy log house formed the centerpiece, with a large barn, corral, and several outbuildings arranged around it. In the distance, cattle grazed on the spring grass, and several horses roamed in a fenced pasture. It wasn't the grand estate of a cattle baron, but neither was it the primitive homestead Emma had half expected. The house itself was larger than she'd anticipated, with glass windows, a luxury on the frontier, and a stone chimney from which smoke spiraled lazily into the clear blue sky. James brought the wagon to a halt in front of the house and helped Emma down, his hands strong but gentle. Up close, she noticed flecks of darker blue in his eyes and the slight nervousness in his otherwise confident demeanor. He gestured toward the porch, indicating she should precede him. The interior of the house surprised Emma even more than its exterior. The main room was spacious and remarkably clean, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall. Well-crafted wooden furniture was arranged comfortably, and to her astonishment, bookshelves lined another wall. A handsome grandfather clock ticked steadily in one corner, and colorful woven rugs softened the plank flooring. James motioned for her to make herself comfortable while he disappeared through a doorway that presumably led to the kitchen. Emma moved to the bookshelves, curious about what volumes a deaf rancher might collect. The selection was impressive and varied. Practical manuals on animal husbandry and agriculture, several histories, some volumes of poetry, and even a few novels. Many appeared well-worn, their spines cracked from frequent reading. She was examining a surprisingly dog-eared copy of Wordsworth when James returned, carrying a tray with coffee cups and a plate of cookies. He set it down on a low table and pulled his notebook from his pocket. "My mother loved poetry, taught me to read before she died. Books became my world." The simple statement carried profound meaning. Emma understood immediately how the written word would become precious to someone who couldn't hear spoken language. She wrote on her slate, "You have a beautiful home. Have you lived here long?" "All my life," he wrote back. "My father built this house when he claimed the land 20 years ago. I was born here." This surprised Emma. "You've never lived elsewhere?" James shook his head, then wrote, "Father took me to Denver once when I was 12. Too noisy, though. I couldn't hear it. Too many people staring." Emma nodded in understanding. She knew all too well how it felt to be the object of curious or pitying glances. She wrote, "How do you manage the ranch alone?" James smiled and gestured for her to follow him to the window. Outside, a teenage boy was working with a horse in the corral. "Samuel Owens," James wrote. "Neighbor's son. Works for me 3 days. A week." As they sipped their coffee, James continued to write short notes about his ranch. 25 cattle, 10 horses, 160 acres. There was unmistakable pride in his written words, the satisfaction of a man who had created something worthwhile, despite challenges that would have defeated many others. Emma found herself increasingly intrigued by this man who had carved out such a self-sufficient existence. When she asked about the leather-working tools she'd noticed on a bench in the corner, his face brightened visibly. "My specialty," he wrote. "I make saddles, bridles, belts. Sell them in town." He rose and beckoned her to follow him to the workbench, where he showed her a half-finished saddle, the leather tooled with intricate designs of oak leaves and acorns. Emma ran her fingers over the detailed work, impressed by the craftsmanship. "Beautiful," she whispered, forgetting momentarily that he couldn't hear her. But James was watching her face and nodded in acknowledgement of her admiration. He wrote, "Your hands understand quality work. I watched you sew." The simple compliment warmed Emma more than any flowery praise might have. It recognized her skill rather than her appearance or social graces, the things most men seem to value in women. After showing her his leatherwork, James led her to the kitchen at the back of the house. The room was surprisingly modern, with a good cast-iron stove and well-organized shelves of supplies. A pot of stew simmered on the stove, filling the space with appetizing aromas. Emma's eyebrows rose in surprise. James grinned at her reaction and wrote, "Expected beans and hardtack. Father made sure I could cook properly, said no one should starve for lack of hearing." The meal was simple, but delicious. Venison stew with vegetables from James's root cellar, fresh bread that he'd baked that morning, and apple preserves that a neighbor had traded for leatherwork. They ate at a solid oak table by the kitchen. Window, sunlight streaming across the blue and white checked tablecloth. Between bites, they exchanged written questions and answers, developing a rhythm of communication that felt increasingly natural. James wrote about his daily routine, rising before dawn to tend the animals, the seasonal cycles of ranch work, his leather crafting during winter evenings. Emma shared stories of Philadelphia, her childhood in her father's printing shop, her passion for reading and sewing. Neither mentioned their respective disabilities directly, yet these conditions hovered in the background of every exchange, not as barriers, but as the very reason they could understand each other's experiences of being set apart. After the meal, James invited Emma to see the rest of the property. The afternoon sun was warm on their backs as they walked from the barn to the corral, James pointing out his projects and plans for the ranch. His ambitions were modest but clear, expanding the herd gradually, improving the breeding stock, perhaps adding an apple orchard near the creek. At the corral, Samuel Owens looked up from his work with the horses and touched his hat respectfully to Emma. "Miss Wilson," he greeted. "Nice to see Mr. Cooper having a visitor. He's been looking forward to your coming something fierce. Cleaned the house twice over." Emma smiled at this revelation, glancing at James, who was examining a piece of tack and hadn't seen the exchange. "He's a good man," Samuel continued, lowering his voice. "Folks in town don't always see it, but there's not a smarter rancher in the county, got methods for raising cattle that others are just starting to figure out." The boy hesitated, then added, "My pa says if Mr. Cooper could hear, he'd be running the biggest spread in the territory by now." Emma nodded, wishing she could respond more fully. She pulled out her slate and wrote, "He seems very capable." "More than capable," Samuel affirmed. "He reads people better than most, who can hear every word, watches everything. Nothing gets past him." He nodded toward James. And animals trust him something special. It's like they know he won't startle them with noise. James turned from his inspection of the tack, catching them in conversation. His expression showed mild curiosity, but no suspicion. He trusted Samuel, Emma realized, a luxury rarely afforded to those with disabilities in a world quick to take advantage of perceived weakness. As the afternoon waned, they returned to the house. James built up the fire against the evening chill and offered more coffee. While he prepared it, Emma noticed what appeared to be a child's slate hanging on the wall near the bookshelves, alongside a framed photograph of a stern-looking man and a woman with James's eyes. When James returned, he saw her studying the photograph. "My parents," he wrote in his notebook. "Mother died when I was 8. Father raised me alone until 5 years ago." Emma pointed questioningly at the slate. "How we communicated," James explained. "Father couldn't use hand signs, fingers damaged in war. We wrote everything, thousands of conversations on slates, like yours." Emma was moved by this glimpse into James's childhood, the adaptations his family had made, the efforts his father had taken to ensure his deaf son could participate fully in their shared life. It spoke of love, expressed not through conventional means, but through persistent effort and creative solutions. As the light began to fade, James reluctantly wrote that they should start back to town. Clara's warning about returning before dark hung between them, unwritten, but understood. The ride back was quiet, both lost in thought as the wagon trundled along the darkening trail. Emma found herself wishing the ranch were closer to Pine Ridge, that their day didn't have to end quite so soon. In James's company, she had felt none of the strain that usually accompanied social interactions. No need to navigate awkward reactions to her limited speech, no pressure to be something she was not. When they reached the boarding house, James helped her down from the wagon, his hand lingering on hers a moment longer than necessary. In the golden light spilling from Clara's windows, his face showed a mixture of hope and uncertainty. He took her slate and wrote, "Thank you for coming. Best day in long time." Emma read his words and felt warmth spread through her chest. She took back the slate and wrote, "When can I see you again?" The smile that transformed James's face was answer enough, but he wrote anyway, "Market day, Thursday, noon." Emma nodded, then on impulse reached out and squeezed his hand. The simple gesture conveyed what neither her weak voice nor written words could fully express: connection, appreciation, understanding. From the porch, Clara cleared her throat pointedly. James stepped back, tipping his hat to both women before climbing back onto his wagon. As he drove away, Emma watched until darkness swallowed the outline of wagon and man. "Well," Clara said, her tone carefully neutral, "I see you've returned safely." Emma nodded, her mind still at the ranch with its books and leather crafts, and the man who had created a life of quiet dignity despite the world's dismissal. "Was it pleasant?" Clara asked, curiosity overcoming her earlier reservations. Emma wrote on her slate, "Very much so. He's kind and intelligent." Clara studied Emma's face. "You're glowing, dear. I haven't seen you look so animated since you arrived." Inside, over tea in the parlor, Clara's questions continued, each answered patiently with Emma's chalk on slate. Yes, his house was clean and well kept. No, he hadn't been improper in any way. Yes, he'd cooked the meal himself. Remarkable, Clara murmured. "Though I suppose when you live alone as he has, you learn to manage." She sipped her tea, then added, "Margaret stopped by this afternoon. She mentioned that Harold Barton was asking about you." Emma raised an eyebrow questioningly. "Seems he's rethinking his hasty judgment," Clara said. "Margaret told him you've become quite valuable at the shop. Several customers specifically requesting your needlework." Emma frowned. Harold's sudden interest came as an unwelcome surprise. She wrote, I have no interest in Mr. Barton's revised opinion. I didn't think you would, Clara replied with satisfaction, though it's worth knowing the man may approach you directly. She studied Emma over the rim of her teacup. Will you be seeing James Cooper again? Emma nodded and wrote, Thursday, market day. Clara's eyebrows rose, but she didn't object. Just be careful, Emma, not of James. I believe you when you say he's honorable. But this town can be unkind to those who stand out. They already whisper about the silent seamstress. If you align yourself with the deaf rancher, those whispers will grow louder. Emma straightened her shoulders and wrote firmly, Let them whisper, I've endured worse. That night, Emma dreamed not of Philadelphia's cobblestone streets, or the life she'd left behind, but of open Wyoming skies and a ranch house filled with books. In her dream, she and James conversed effortlessly without slate or paper, understanding flowing between them like the creek that wound through his land. She woke before dawn, restless with new possibilities. For the first time since the illness that had taken her voice and her parents, Emma felt the stirring of something like hope, not just for survival, but for a life with meaning. The week crawled by, each day at Margaret's shop, stretching endlessly as Emma anticipated Thursday's meeting. She found herself watching the door whenever the bell jingled, hoping to see James, even though she knew he rarely came to town except on market days. Margaret noticed her distraction when Emma pricked her finger for the third time while embroidering a delicate cuff. You've got it bad, haven't you? The dressmaker asked with a knowing smile. Emma felt heat rise to her cheeks as she shook her head in denial. No use pretending with me, girl, Margaret said, sitting down beside her. I've seen that look before. Clara told me about your Sunday adventure, said you came back looking happier than she'd ever seen you. Emma busied herself with her stitching, avoiding Margaret's gaze. I think it's wonderful, Margaret continued, surprising Emma. This town needs more people willing to see beyond what's on the surface. And James Cooper deserves some happiness. That man's had more than his share of hardship. Emma looked up questioningly. You didn't know? His mother died of fever when he was young. His father raised him alone, taught him to read lips and use that hand language. Then when James was 25, his father fell from a horse, broke his neck. Didn't kill him outright, but left him bedridden. James cared for him for almost 2 years before the old man passed. This new knowledge settled over Emma like a mantle. She had sensed a deep well of strength in James, but hadn't understood its source. His self-sufficiency wasn't just adaptation to deafness. It was born of necessity, of responsibilities shouldered far too young. That ranch should have failed a dozen times over, Margaret continued. But somehow James kept it going, even when drought took half the cattle in the county 3 summers ago. He's got away with animals like they understand him better than people do. When Thursday finally arrived, Emma dressed with special care in a blue calico dress she'd made herself, with buttons of carved bone that complemented her chestnut hair. At precisely noon, she stood outside Barton's general store, heart fluttering against her ribs like a bird seeking freedom. The market day crowd bustled around her, farmers with produce, ranchers with goods to trade, townspeople taking advantage of the weekly gathering to socialize. Emma stood apart, watching for the familiar figure of James among the strangers. The clock on the mercantile wall showed 12:30, and still no sign of James. Emma shifted uneasily, ignoring the curious glances from passers-by. Perhaps he had changed his mind, or worse, something had happened to him on the ranch, an accident with no one to hear his calls for help. Just as anxiety began to tighten her chest, Emma spotted Harold Barton approaching, his smile holding none of the warmth she'd glimpsed in James's eyes. "Miss Wilson," he greeted with exaggerated volume, as though her voice affliction affected her hearing. "Waiting for someone?" Emma gave a non-committal nod, hoping he would continue on his way. If you're expecting Cooper, I'm afraid you'll be disappointed. Harold's tone carried a note of satisfaction. Sheriff Miller detained him at the livery stable. Seems there was some confusion about payment for feed. Alarm flashed through Emma. She reached for her slate, but Harold continued before she could write. Such a shame. The challenges of conducting business when one can't properly communicate. He shook his head in mock sympathy. Perhaps this illustrates why certain arrangements are unwise. Emma's chalk nearly snapped as she wrote, "Where is the livery stable?" Harold's smile faded. "Now, Miss Wilson, this is hardly a matter for a lady to involve herself in. The sheriff will sort it out." She brushed past him, slate clutched to her chest, and headed toward the far end of the main street where she recalled seeing the livery. Harold called after her, but she didn't turn back. The scene at the livery stable made her blood boil. James stood in the center of a small crowd, his normally confident posture tense with frustration. Sheriff Miller, a stocky man with a handlebar mustache, was speaking loudly and slowly, exaggerating his mouth movements in a way that bordered on mockery. "I said, do you have a receipt?" The sheriff practically shouted, as though volume could overcome deafness. James's hands moved rapidly in signs Emma couldn't understand, his expression a mixture of anger and humiliation. The livery owner, a thin man with stooped shoulders, stood to the side, shaking his head. "I told him last month the price went up," the man was saying to the gathered onlookers. "Not my fault if he can't understand plain English." Emma pushed through the crowd until she stood at James's side. His eyes widened in surprise, then softened with relief at the sight of her. She quickly wrote on her slate, "What happened?" James took the slate. His writing hurried. "Price changed. Livery says I owe more. Already paid what was agreed." Emma turned to face the sheriff and livery owner. She wrote on her slate and held it up for all to see. "Mr. Cooper cannot hear you shouting. What exactly is the dispute?" The sheriff glanced at her words with obvious irritation. "This isn't your concern, miss." The livery owner was more forthcoming. "Cooper has an account for horse feed. Prices went up 2 cents a pound last month due to the rail freight increases. Posted a notice right here on the door." He gestured to a weathered paper tacked beside the entrance. "He shorted me $3 on his last pickup." Emma looked at James, who was watching the exchange intently, trying to follow the conversation through expressions and gestures. She could see the frustration in the tight set of his jaw. She wrote on the slate and showed it to James. "Did you know about the price increase?" He shook his head firmly, then took the slate. "Would have paid if I knew. Never seen notice." Of course he hadn't. A written notice would only work if someone brought it to his attention, or if he happened to look directly at it. Emma wrote a longer message and showed it to the sheriff and livery owner. Mr. Cooper was unaware of the price change. A written notice is insufficient for someone who cannot hear verbal announcements. He has always paid his debts promptly and will pay the difference now if you state the exact amount. The sheriff read her words aloud, his tone grudging. "Well, Perkins, what's the exact amount owed?" The livery owner hesitated, then mumbled, $3.24. James, who had been watching their lips carefully, immediately reached into his pocket and produced the exact amount. He handed it to Perkins with a dignity that made Emma's heart ache. The sheriff shrugged. "Seems this matter is resolved," he said, then turned to the dispersing crowd. "Show's over, folks. Go about your business." As the onlookers scattered, Emma noticed Harold Barton lingering on the periphery, disappointment evident in his face. She had no doubt he'd played some role in this humiliation. James touched her arm gently to get her attention. When she looked at him, he signed "Thank you," one of the few gestures she recognized, his eyes conveying depths of gratitude words couldn't express. She smiled and wrote, "Still have time for lunch?" His answering smile chased away the last traces of tension from his face. They walked to a small cafe at the edge of town, away from the prying eyes of the market day crowd. The owner, Mrs. Reynolds, greeted them with a warm smile that contained no judgment, only welcome. "Take any table you like," she told Emma, then nodded respectfully to James. "Good to see you again, Mr. Cooper." Over bowls of hearty stew and fresh bread, they exchanged the slate back and forth. James explained that he'd been delayed because the sheriff had intercepted him almost immediately upon his arrival in town. "I should have expected trouble," he wrote. "Harold Barton never forgave me for outbidding him on the Peterson cattle last fall. Thought ranching would be easy money. Was angry when the deaf man got the better stock." As they ate, Emma noticed James was unusually attentive to their surroundings, his eyes constantly scanning the room. She realized he was compensating for his lack of hearing with heightened visual awareness. Nothing escaped his notice. Not the couple arguing silently at a corner table, nor the child sneaking cookies when his mother wasn't looking, nor the subtle glances cast their way by other diners. "You read people well," she wrote. James nodded. "Have to. Survival. People say much with faces and bodies they don't say with words." This insight struck Emma deeply. She too had learned to read the subtle shifts in expression, the microaggressions hidden behind polite society smiles. Their disabilities had given them similar perceptions through different paths. "I brought something for you," James wrote, pulling a small package from his jacket pocket. Wrapped in brown paper, tied with string, was a slim book, a manual of hand communication for the deaf. It was well worn, its pages soft from years of handling. "My mother's," James explained, "thought you might want to learn. Easier than writing everything." Emma was touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. She opened the book, flipping through pages illustrated with hand positions and their corresponding meanings. "I would like to learn," she wrote, then hesitantly attempted to form the sign for "thank you" as shown in an early page. James's face brightened. He gently corrected the position of her fingers, his touch light but sure. The moment of connection lingered between them, a bridge built of shared understanding. After lunch, they walked through the market together, James purchasing supplies for the ranch, introducing Emma to vendors he trusted with simple gestures and written notes. She observed how some treated him with respect, engaging patiently in their unconventional communication, while others spoke to him as though he were a child, or worse, addressed only her, as if James weren't present. Through it all, he maintained a stoic dignity that Emma admired. The humiliation at the livery stable had been frustrating but not surprising to him. Just another day, navigating a world designed for hearing people. At the mercantile, Harold Barton watched their progress through the store with undisguised disapproval. When James went to examine tools in another aisle, Harold approached Emma. "I see you've become quite the champion for our local oddity," he said in a low voice. "Is this some misguided Eastern charity, Miss Wilson? Or perhaps you believe damaged goods should stick together?" The cruelty of his words stung, but Emma had endured worse in Philadelphia drawing rooms. She wrote on her slate, "Mr. Cooper is more of a gentleman than many who can hear and speak perfectly well." Harold's face flushed. "You're making a spectacle of yourself. First arriving as a mail-order bride, then being rejected, and now this. Association with a deaf rancher. People are talking." Emma shrugged and wrote, "Let them. Their opinions matter little to me." "They should," Harold hissed. "A woman alone can't afford to ignore society's judgment. You have no protector, no family. Your reputation is all you have." The truth in his words cut deeper than she wanted to admit. She did stand alone, her future precarious, but yielding to the petty prejudices of Pine Ridge was a price too high to pay for security. Before she could respond, James returned, immediately sensing the tension. He looked between Emma and Harold, his expression questioning. Harold switched to an artificial smile. "Mr. Cooper," he said with exaggerated mouth movements, "just having a friendly chat with Miss Wilson. Good day to you both." He retreated to his counter, where several customers awaited his attention. Outside in the spring sunshine, James took the slate. "What did he say to upset you?" Emma hesitated, then wrote, "He thinks we shouldn't be friends because of our differences." James's jaw tightened, but his response surprised her. "He may be right. Your life would be easier without the complications I bring." The selflessness of his concern touched Emma deeply. She wrote firmly, "I've had enough of easy paths that lead nowhere. I prefer difficult journeys with worthwhile companions." Something shifted in James's expression, a wall coming down, hope cautiously rising. He offered his arm, and she took it, conscious of the statement they made, walking arm in arm down Pine Ridge's main street. They reached Clara's boarding house too soon. On the porch, away from curious eyes, James took Emma's slate one last time. "Can I see you again, Sunday dinner?" She nodded, then impulsively reached up to touch his cheek, letting her fingers say what her voice and chalk could not. James caught her hand, pressing it gently against his face for a moment before releasing it with obvious reluctance. As he walked away, Emma clutched the sign language book to her chest, already planning to study it before their next meeting. Clara was waiting in the parlor, her expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. "I heard about the commotion at the livery," she said. "Half the town's talking about how you rushed to James Cooper's defense." Emma nodded, unapologetic. "Harold Barton came by earlier," Clara continued. "Seemed quite disturbed. Said you were compromising yourself by associating with James." Emma's eyes flashed with anger as she wrote, "Harold Barton engineered that entire incident to humiliate James. He's a petty, cruel man." Clara sighed. "I don't disagree with your assessment of Harold. But Emma, you must consider your position carefully. You're still building your life here. Creating enemies of influential townspeople is risky. So is abandoning someone because they're different." Emma wrote, "I won't do it, not again." The words slipped out before she could reconsider them. Clara's eyebrows rose. "Again? There's a story there, I think." Emma hesitated, then wrote, "Slowly, after my illness, many friends vanished. Conversation became too difficult. Invitations stopped. My fiancé returned my ring with a note saying he couldn't bear a lifetime of silence." Clara's expression softened. "Oh, my dear, no wonder you understand James's isolation." "We speak the same language," Emma wrote, "one of patience and perseverance." For the next 2 days, Emma devoted herself to learning sign language from James's book. Her fingers, nimble from years of detailed needlework, quickly adapted to the precise movements. She practiced between customers at Margaret's shop, during meals, and late into the night by candlelight. Margaret caught her signing to herself while sorting buttons on Saturday afternoon. "Well, look at you," she said with approval. "That's a far better solution than that slate you're always carrying." Emma smiled, grateful for the encouragement. She wrote, "I want to surprise James tomorrow. Show him I'm making an effort to learn his language. That man's smitten with you already." Margaret chuckled. "This will absolutely seal his fate." On Sunday, Emma was surprised when Samuel Owens arrived with the wagon instead of James. "He's laid up with a nasty cut," Samuel explained. "Nothing serious, but he wanted me to fetch you if you're still willing to come. Said he'd understand if you'd rather not." Emma gathered her reticule and shawl without hesitation, much to Clara's dismay. "Alone at his ranch while he's injured?" Clara fretted. "It's not proper." "My mother's there," Samuel interjected. "Came over to help with the cooking and such. She can chaperone just fine." This assurance slightly mollified Clara, though she still insisted Emma return before nightfall. The ride to the ranch seemed quicker this time, Emma's anticipation growing with each mile. When they arrived, Samuel led her to the house where she found James sitting by the fire, his right hand bandaged and resting in a sling. His face lit up at the sight of her, though embarrassment quickly followed. "Caught his arm on a broken fence post," explained a plump, friendly-faced woman Emma assumed was Ruth Owens. Men and their stubborn pride wouldn't ride for the doctor until he'd finished mending the entire fence line. Required 7 stitches. James grimaced at Mrs. Owens's recounting, even though he couldn't hear the words. He clearly understood she was discussing his injury from her gestures toward his bandaged hand. His expression was a mixture of embarrassment and resignation, as though he didn't appreciate being the subject of conversation, but was accustomed to it. Mrs. Owens addressed Emma directly. "You must be Miss Wilson. I'm Ruth Owens. James has told us, or rather written us, so much about you." She smiled warmly. "I'll just be in the kitchen finishing dinner. Samuel will help with the afternoon chores." As they departed, leaving Emma and James alone in the main room, an awkward silence fell. James looked frustrated by his injury, as though he had failed her somehow by not being at his best. Emma set down her reticule and removed her bonnet. Then, instead of reaching for her slate, she raised her hands and carefully signed, "I've been practicing." James's expression transformed from surprise to wonder. He sat forward eagerly, his own uninjured hand coming up to sign back. "You learned for me?" She nodded, forming the signs with deliberate care. "Your book helped. Still learning. Go slow, please." The joy on his face made every hour of practice worthwhile. He signed slowly. "This means more than you know." For the next hour, they conversed in this new shared language. Emma frequently consulting the book she'd brought along, James patiently correcting her form when needed. It was halting and imperfect, but infinitely more intimate than passing a slate back and forth. When Mrs. Owens called them for dinner, Emma was surprised to realize how quickly the time had passed. The meal itself was a pleasant affair, with Mrs. Owens filling the silence with cheerful chatter about local news, while Emma and James communicated through a combination of signs, facial expressions, and occasional written notes. "It's remarkable," Mrs. Owens commented, watching them. "I've known James since he was a boy, and I've never seen him communicate so easily with anyone outside his family." After dinner, despite James's protests, Mrs. Owens insisted on clearing up alone. "You two go sit by the fire. That hand needs rest, James Cooper, and I won't hear arguments." In the fading light of afternoon, they returned to the main room where James carefully added logs to the fire, one-handed. When he turned back to Emma, his expression had grown serious. "I need to ask something important," he signed, his movements deliberate. Emma nodded, her heart quickening. "People in town are talking about you because of me," he continued. "Harold Barton spreading rumors, said you're ruining your chances by spending time with the deaf man." Emma frowned, signing, "Harold Barton doesn't decide my life." "But he's right," James insisted. "You could have a normal life, find a husband who can hear, have an easier path." The frustration that had simmered since the incident at the livery burst forth. Emma signed emphatically, "Don't want an easier path? Don't want normal." She paused, struggling to find the right signs, then resorted to the slate. "I came west hoping for a fresh start, yes, but also for authenticity. In Philadelphia, I pretended my voice would return, that I could still fit into society. It was exhausting and lonely. Here with you, I don't pretend. I don't need to." James read her words, his expression softening. He wrote beneath her message, "I feel the same, but I worry. Life with me would never be easy." "Life isn't meant to be easy," she wrote. "It's meant to be lived truthfully." Something shifted. In James's gaze, determination replacing uncertainty, he set down the slate and with his good hand signed slowly, "Then, may I court you properly, with intention?" The directness of his question took Emma's breath away. In Philadelphia, courtship was a dance of innuendo and social maneuvering. James offered honesty instead, a clear path rather than a maze of conventions. Her hands trembled slightly as she signed, "Yes, I would like that very much." The smile that spread across James's face held the promise of spring after a long winter, hope blooming in unlikely soil. In that moment, in a ranch house far from the world she'd known, Emma Wilson felt something she had thought lost forever, the sensation of coming home. By May, spring had fully embraced Wyoming Territory. The hills surrounding Pine Ridge bloomed with wildflowers, and calves frolicked in pastures under watchful maternal eyes. In Margaret's dressmaking shop, business thrived as townspeople requested new garments for the upcoming spring festival. "I've never been so busy," Margaret sighed, sorting through orders piled on her work table. "Every woman in town wants a new dress for the dancing." Emma smiled as she pinned the hem of a lavender silk gown commissioned by the banker's wife. Over the past month, she had become indispensable to Margaret, her skillful needlework earning admiration even from those who whispered about her association with the deaf rancher. Margaret paused in her work, studying Emma with motherly concern. "You know the spring festival is next weekend. The whole town will be there." Emma nodded, continuing her precise stitches. "Has James mentioned taking you?" Margaret asked, setting down her scissors. Emma signed, "He hasn't mentioned it." Her hands moved with growing fluency after weeks of diligent practice. Margaret, who had picked up a few basic signs herself, understood enough to follow. Maybe he doesn't know about it. These town events aren't exactly priorities for a man who lives miles from civilization. The bell above the shop door jingled, and both women looked up to see Clara entering, her expression troubled. "Emma, dear, could you come to the boarding house? There's someone who wishes to speak with you." Margaret waved her off. "Go on. The banker's wife won't need this gown until tomorrow." As they walked down the main street, Clara explained in a low voice. "A gentleman arrived on the morning train and says he's come from Philadelphia. Claims he's been searching for you for months." Emma's steps faltered, her mind racing through possibilities. Who from her old life would track her to Wyoming? The answer waited in Clara's parlor, a tall, distinguished man in his 50s with silver-streaked hair and familiar features that widened at the sight of her. "Emma," he breathed, rising from his chair. "Thank God you're alive." She recognized him immediately. George Montgomery, her father's former business partner and the father of the man who had once been her fiancé. The last time she'd seen him was at her parents' funeral. Clara discreetly withdrew, leaving them alone. Emma reached for her slate, but before she could write, Montgomery crossed the room and embraced her. "We feared the worst," he said, releasing her to study her face. "When you sold the house and disappeared. If your father's solicitor hadn't mentioned you'd inquired about trains west." He shook his head. "Why, Emma? Why flee without a word?" She wrote quickly, "I needed a fresh start. Philadelphia held too many painful memories." Montgomery read her words, his expression softening. "I understand that. But to leave everyone who cared about you, to throw yourself into the wilderness, without protection. I'm not as fragile as everyone believed," she wrote firmly. "Clearly not," he acknowledged, glancing around the modest parlor. "But this can't be the life Richard and Elizabeth Wilson wanted for their daughter. Living in a boarding house in a frontier town, working as what? A seamstress?" His tone held no malice, only genuine concern. Yet Emma bristled at the implied judgment. She was about to respond when Montgomery continued. "I've come to bring you home, Emma. My son William has been inconsolable since you left. He asked me to find you and convey his deepest regrets for breaking your engagement. He realizes now what a fool he was." Shock rendered Emma momentarily speechless. William had returned her ring with a note expressing relief that they wouldn't face a lifetime of awkward silence. Now he regretted his decision. Montgomery misinterpreted her silence as consideration. "He's prepared to marry you immediately upon your return. The house on Spruce Street is still available. He would purchase it for you. You could resume your rightful place in society." Emma's hands trembled as she wrote, "Why this change of heart?" Montgomery hesitated. "William has matured, and there have been developments with your father's estate. The railway investments your father made before his death have increased substantially in value. The trustee has been attempting to locate you as the sole heir." Understanding dawned with painful clarity. She wasn't destitute after all. And suddenly William found his conscience? "How much?" she wrote bluntly. "A considerable sum," Montgomery admitted. "Enough to make you one of Philadelphia's wealthier young women." Emma took a deep breath, organizing her thoughts. She had come to Wyoming believing she needed a husband for security. Now she learned she had options: financial independence, a return to familiar surroundings, even a rekindled engagement. Yet as she contemplated these possibilities, she felt no pull toward her former life. Instead, her mind filled with images of James's ranch, his patient hands teaching her to sign, the quiet understanding between them that required no words at all. "I'm not returning to Philadelphia," she wrote with steady resolve. "Please thank William for his timely change of heart, but I must decline." Montgomery's eyebrows rose in disbelief. "Surely you're not serious. What could possibly hold you in this primitive place?" Before she could answer, the parlor door opened and Clara appeared with James behind her. He was dressed in his Sunday best, his hat in his hands, clearly not expecting to find Emma with a stranger. Clara looked apologetic. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but Mr. Cooper had arranged to take Emma to dinner." Montgomery turned to study James, whose eyes remained fixed on Emma, sensing her distress. Without hesitation, James crossed to her side, his questioning gaze never leaving her face. Emma signed rapidly. "This is my father's friend from Philadelphia. He wants me to return." Understanding dawned in James's expression, followed by a shadow of resignation. He nodded slightly, then extended his hand to Montgomery with dignified formality. Montgomery's shock was evident as he automatically shook James's hand. "I don't understand. Who is this man?" Clara stepped forward. "Mr. Montgomery, this is James Cooper. He owns one of the more successful ranches in the area, and he's deaf." "Deaf?" Montgomery asked, observing the sign exchange between Emma and James. "Yes," Clara confirmed, "and one of the finest men in the territory." Montgomery turned to Emma with dawning comprehension. "Is this why you won't return to Philadelphia? Because of him?" Emma signed to James. "He discovered I've inherited money. William wants to marry me now." A flicker of pain crossed James's features before he carefully schooled his expression. He signed back, "You should consider the offer. Security, a familiar place." The selflessness of his response, putting her welfare above his own desires, cemented Emma's decision. She turned to Montgomery and wrote firmly, "I'm building a life here, a good life, with people who value me as I am, not despite or because of my limitations." Montgomery looked between them, his worldview visibly shaken. "Emma, be reasonable. What kind of future could you possibly have with—" He gestured helplessly at James. "With these circumstances?" James, who had been reading their lips, as best he could, straightened his shoulders. He took Emma's slate and wrote in his precise hand, "Mr. Montgomery, I understand your concern for Emma's welfare. It's a concern I share, but I believe a person's worth isn't measured by their limitations, but by their determination to overcome them. Montgomery read these words with surprise, clearly not expecting such eloquence from a frontier rancher, much less a deaf one. Emma added beneath James's message, "I came west seeking a husband for security. I found something more valuable, self-reliance and happiness. I won't trade that for all the comfort Philadelphia offers." "At least take time to consider," Montgomery pleaded. "I'll be staying at the hotel for 3 days before returning east. The railway shares are yours regardless of your decision. I'll make arrangements with the local bank." After Montgomery departed, an awkward silence fell. Clara tactfully excused herself, leaving Emma and James alone in the parlor. "I'm sorry," James signed. "Bad timing." "No," Emma replied. "Perfect timing. Now everything is clear." James's expression remained troubled. "You have a chance for a better life now. Money changes things." Emma shook her head firmly. "Money doesn't change what matters." She hesitated, then added, "Unless you don't want me to stay." The vulnerability in her question broke through James's careful reserve. He took her hands, stilling their motion, and looked directly into her eyes. Then he released her to sign. "I want you in my life more than anything, but I need to know you stay for the right reasons, not because you have nowhere else to go." In that moment, Emma realized the depth of James's insecurities, not about his deafness, but about being chosen freely, without reservation. She reached for the slate, needing to express herself fully. "I'm staying because in Philadelphia, I was defined by what I'd lost, my voice, my family, my place in society. Here, with you, I'm defined by what I've found, strength, purpose, and a connection I never thought possible. My inheritance changes nothing about what I want or who I want to be with." James read her words, his eyes suspiciously bright in the afternoon light. He wrote beneath her message, "Then will you come to the spring festival with me as my declared sweetheart?" A smile bloomed across Emma's face as she signed an emphatic yes. The morning of the spring festival dawned clear and warm, a perfect late May day. Pine Ridge's main street had been transformed with ribbons and flowers, commemorating the arrival of spring and the town's hopes for a prosperous growing season. Stalls lined the thoroughfare, offering everything from homemade preserves to handcrafted jewelry. In the town square, a platform had been erected for speeches and later a dance floor for the evening's festivities. Emma stood before the mirror in her room at the boarding house, adjusting the collar of her new dress, a creation of her own design in deep blue silk with delicate embroidery at the cuffs and neckline. Margaret had insisted she use the finest fabric in the shop. "If you're going to make a statement, make it magnificent," the dressmaker had declared, and a statement it would be. Today, Emma would appear publicly as James's sweetheart for the first time, an announcement that would formalize their courtship to the entire community. Clara knocked on her door. "James is here," she called, "and my goodness, the man cleans up well." In the parlor, James waited in a new suit of charcoal gray, his hair neatly trimmed, boots polished to a shine. When Emma entered, his expression of admiration needed no translation. "You look beautiful," he signed. "So do you," she replied with a teasing smile. Clara watched their exchange with misty eyes. "You two will be the handsomest couple there," she declared. "Now off with you. The festivities are starting." As they walked toward the town square, Emma was acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed them. Some were merely curious, others openly disapproving. Harold Barton stood outside his store, his face darkening at the sight of them arm in arm. Yet for every hostile glance, there seemed to be a friendly nod. Margaret waved cheerfully from her stall displaying handmade lace. Samuel Owens tipped his hat respectfully, his parents beside him offering warm smiles. Even Sheriff Miller nodded a grudging acknowledgement. The morning passed pleasantly as they explored the various stalls. James purchased a ribbon for Emma's hair, a deep green that complemented her blue dress. She helped him select a handcrafted silver buckle from the silversmith's display. They were examining a woodworker's carvings when George Montgomery approached, looking somewhat out of place in his Eastern attire. "Emma," he greeted, then nodded to James. "Mr. Cooper." To her surprise, Montgomery attempted a clumsy finger-spelled hello that made James's eyebrows rise in surprise. "I spoke with Mrs. Jenkins yesterday," Montgomery explained. "She suggested I might better understand your decision if I learned a bit about your communication methods." Emma smiled, touched by his effort. She wrote on her slate, "Thank you for trying." "I've made arrangements with the bank as promised," Montgomery continued. "Your inheritance will be available to you here. I'll leave the details with Mrs. Jenkins before I depart tomorrow." James, who had been following their lips, signed to Emma, "He seems to accept your decision." She nodded, then wrote for Montgomery, "I appreciate your concern for my welfare. Please tell everyone in Philadelphia that I am well and happy." Montgomery studied her face, then James's, and something in his expression softened. "I believe you are. Your father would be proud of the independent woman you've become, different from what he might have envisioned, but proud nonetheless." After he walked away, James signed, "Good man, cares for you." "Yes," Emma agreed, "but he belongs to my past." At noon, the town gathered before the platform where Mayor Thompson delivered a speech recounting Pine Ridge's growth and prospects for the coming year. James and Emma stood at the edge of the crowd, where he could watch the mayor's lips without obstruction. As the speech concluded, the mayor announced, "And now, in celebration of our community spirit, we've prepared a special surprise. This new bell will hang in our recently completed schoolhouse, calling the children of Pine Ridge to education for generations to come." A cloth was pulled away, revealing a gleaming brass bell mounted on a temporary stand. The mayor gestured, "To the oldest resident of Pine Ridge, to do the honors of the first ring." As the bell's clear tone rang out across the square, Emma felt James's hand tighten on hers. She looked up to find his expression transformed with wonder. "I felt it," he signed excitedly, "the vibration through the ground and in the air. I felt the bell's voice." The simple joy in his face moved Emma deeply. In that moment, she understood something profound about James. He didn't dwell on what he couldn't experience, but found wonder in what he could. After the ceremony, they joined the community picnic spread across the town square. They sat with the Owens family, communicating through a mixture of signs, lip reading, and written notes that had become second nature to their growing circle. As they ate, Emma noticed Harold Barton deep in conversation with several town council members, casting occasional glances in their direction. The intensity of his gaze made her uneasy. The afternoon festivities included children's races, a horseshoe competition, which James entered and won handily, and various exhibits of local crafts and produce. By late afternoon, the celebration shifted toward preparations for the evening dance. Musicians began setting up on the platform, testing their instruments. Lanterns were strung across the square, waiting to be lit at dusk. Couples strolled arm in arm, ladies in their finest dresses, gentlemen in suits rarely worn on the frontier. James guided Emma to a quiet spot beneath a large cottonwood tree at the edge of the square. His expression had grown serious. "I need to ask you something important," he signed. Emma nodded, her heart quickening at his solemnity. "Your inheritance changes things," he continued. "You don't need a husband for security now. You could build any life you want." She started to protest, but he gently stopped her hands. "Let me finish. I want you to stay because you choose me, not because it's your only option. So I'm asking clearly, would you consider becoming my wife? Not today or tomorrow, but when you're certain it's what you want. The directness of his proposal, so typical of James's straightforward nature, brought tears to Emma's eyes. There was no artifice here, no social maneuvering or calculation of advantage, just a man asking a woman to share his life with all its challenges and joys. Before she could respond, Mayor Thompson's voice boomed from the platform, calling for everyone's attention. Before we begin our spring festival dance, the town council has an announcement regarding an exciting development for Pine Ridge. James frowned, unable to hear the announcement. Emma started to translate, but the mayor's next words froze her hands mid-sign. Mr. Harold Barton has generously proposed funding a new community project, a home for unfortunates unable to care for themselves due to disability or infirmity. A murmur ran through the crowd as Harold stepped onto the platform, the very picture of benevolent philanthropy. "My friends and neighbors," Harold began, his voice carrying across the square. "Progress means not just economic growth, but also demonstrating our Christian charity toward those less fortunate. I propose establishing the Pine Ridge Asylum for the disabled, where those suffering from afflictions such as deafness, muteness, and similar conditions can receive proper care." Emma felt James stiffen beside her, his eyes narrowing as he read Harold's lips. "These unfortunates often struggle to maintain independent lives," Harold continued, "as we've witnessed in our own community. The noble attempt of Mr. Cooper to run a ranch despite his limitations, or Miss Wilson's efforts to support herself despite her vocal affliction. These are admirable but ultimately challenging paths." The calculated cruelty of Harold's announcement, disguised as charity, left Emma breathless with anger. This was his response to their public courtship, an attempt to classify them as pitiable invalids incapable of normal lives. James's face had gone very still, his jaw tight with controlled fury. Without hesitation, he took Emma's hand and led her directly toward the platform, cutting through the crowd with determined strides. Harold faltered mid-sentence as he saw them approach, a flicker of unease crossing his face. Reaching the edge of the platform, James helped Emma up the steps, then followed, standing tall before the assembled townspeople. The crowd fell silent, watching the unexpected interruption with collective held breath. Emma looked out at the faces, some curious, some uncomfortable, some openly hostile, others supportive. This was the moment that would define their future. In Pine Ridge, taking a deep breath, she turned to face Harold Barton, her chin high, her purpose clear. Standing before the assembled townspeople, Emma felt a lifetime of held-back words pressing against her throat. For once, she wished for her full voice, but would have to make do with what she had. She turned to James, signing quickly, "May I speak for us?" He nodded, his trust in her evident even amid his anger. Emma faced Harold Barton, who watched with barely concealed contempt. Drawing a deep breath, she pushed her damaged voice to its limits. "Mr. Barton," she began, her words raspy but audible in the hushed square, "your concern is misplaced." The crowd murmured in surprise at hearing her speak for the first time. Emma pressed on, each word carefully formed. "We do not need your charity or your asylum." Harold's smile turned patronizing. "Miss Wilson, your condition clearly affects your judgment. While admirable, your independence and Mr. Cooper's is ultimately unsustainable. My proposal would ensure you both receive proper care." James stepped forward, his expression resolute. He took the slate that hung from Emma's wrist and wrote in bold strokes, "I run a profitable ranch. I support myself through hard work. I need no charity or asylum." He held the slate up for all to see, his gaze challenging anyone to dispute his words. Mayor Thompson looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Barton meant no offense, I'm sure. His proposal comes from genuine concern. "No!" Emma interrupted, her strained voice carrying surprising authority. "His proposal comes from prejudice, disguised as kindness." Harold's face flushed red. "You forget yourself, Miss Wilson. You arrived here, penniless, rejected as a mail-order bride, taken in through the town's goodwill. And you, Cooper," he turned to James with undisguised disdain, "you may manage that small ranch of yours, but let's not pretend you wouldn't benefit from specialized care." Margaret pushed through the crowd to stand beneath the platform. "That's enough, Harold. James Cooper runs one of the most efficient ranches in the county, and Emma's work has doubled my business." Samuel Owens joined her. "Mr. Cooper taught me more about ranching in 3 months than my own father did in 10 years. He doesn't need anyone's help or pity." Harold's expression hardened. "This emotional display doesn't change facts. People with such severe impediments require specialized supervision. The council will vote on my proposal next week." Emma felt James's hand take hers. He stepped forward again, writing quickly on the slate. "I came to this celebration to announce my intention to marry Miss Wilson, with her consent. We are not seeking charity but respect for our choice to build a life together." A hush fell over the crowd as James's written declaration was passed around. Some faces showed shock, others disapproval, but Emma also noted nods of support and smiles of encouragement from unexpected quarters. Harold scoffed. "Marriage? Between two people who can barely communicate with normal society? How would you raise children? How would you engage in commerce or civic duties?" Before either could respond, George Montgomery stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. As a distinguished visitor from the East, his presence commanded immediate attention. "If I may address this gathering," he began formally, "I've known Miss Wilson since childhood. She was raised in one of Philadelphia's finest families and received an excellent education. Her vocal condition resulted from an illness that claimed her parents. Despite this tragedy, she maintained their business affairs competently until deciding to seek a new beginning here." He turned to James with newfound respect. "And while I've known Mr. Cooper only briefly, I've observed his intelligence, dignity, and industriousness. In Philadelphia's highest circles, we consider a man's character the measure of his worth, not his physical capabilities." Montgomery faced Harold directly. "Furthermore, Miss Wilson has recently inherited a substantial fortune through her father's investments. She chooses to remain in Pine Ridge, not from necessity, but from preference for the life and community she's found here. Specifically, her preference for Mr. Cooper's company." Murmurs rippled through the crowd at this revelation. Emma squeezed James's hand in silent gratitude for Montgomery's unexpected advocacy. Harold looked momentarily disconcerted before recovering. "Money doesn't eliminate their limitations. An asylum would still provide appropriate—" "No," Mayor Thompson interrupted, clearly reassessing the situation in light of Montgomery's revelations. "I believe we've heard enough, Harold. Your proposal was offered in what you considered the town's best interest, but it appears Miss Wilson and Mr. Cooper have made their own arrangements." He turned to address the gathering. "This is a celebration of our town's progress. Part of that progress must include recognizing that people overcome challenges in different ways. If Miss Wilson and Mr. Cooper have found happiness together despite, or perhaps because of, their unique circumstances, who are we to interfere?" Harold's face darkened with humiliation. "The council vote can wait," the mayor concluded firmly. "For now, I believe we have a dance to commence, and perhaps a courtship to celebrate." He gestured toward Emma and James with a tentative smile. The tension in the square gradually dissolved as the musicians struck up a lively tune, signaling a return to the planned festivities. Harold Barton stormed off the platform, pushing through the crowd without meeting anyone's eyes. Emma felt a momentary pang of sympathy for him, a man so consumed by propriety and appearance that he couldn't recognize the humanity in difference. As people began to pair up for dancing, Emma and James remained on the platform, suddenly uncertain. Montgomery approached, offering a formal bow to them both. "I hope I didn't overstep," he said, "but I couldn't stand by while that man disguised his prejudice as concern." Emma signed her thanks, which James translated aloud in his rarely used voice for Montgomery's benefit. "She is grateful, as am I." Montgomery nodded. "I'll be leaving tomorrow, Emma. Your father would be proud of the life you're building here. Different from what he might have imagined, but no less worthy." He extended his hand to James. "Take care of her, Mr. Cooper, though I suspect she's equally capable of taking care of you." After Montgomery departed, James and Emma descended from the platform into a community transformed. People who had previously avoided them now approached with tentative greetings. Some attempted clumsy signs they'd clearly just learned from Samuel or the Owens family. Others simply nodded with newfound respect. As lanterns were lit across the square and twilight settled over Pine Ridge, James turned to Emma with a question in his eyes. He signed, "Dance with me?" She hesitated. "You can dance?" A smile tugged at his lips. "Father taught me the steps. Said I didn't need to hear music to move with grace." He led her to the edge of the dance floor where the vibrations from the musicians' instruments were strongest. Placing her hand on his shoulder, he took her waist, gently guiding her into a simple waltz. What they lacked in precision, they made up for in connection. James counted the rhythm in his head, his steps, sure and steady. Emma followed his lead, marveling at this new dimension of the man she'd come to love. They weren't the most accomplished dancers in Pine Ridge that night, but they were perhaps the most watched, not with the previous stares of curiosity or pity, but with a dawning recognition that love and determination could overcome boundaries, most considered insurmountable. As the evening drew to a close, James escorted Emma back to Clara's boarding house. On the porch, shielded from curious eyes by the gathering darkness, he signed, "You never answered my question from earlier." Emma tilted her head questioningly. "About becoming my wife," he clarified, before Harold's announcement. The events of the day had nearly pushed his proposal from her mind. Now, in the quiet aftermath of their public stand, the question returned, with even greater significance. She didn't hesitate, her hands forming the signs with certainty. "Yes, I would be honored to marry you." James's smile illuminated his face, joy radiating from him like heat from a flame. From his pocket, he withdrew a small, worn box. Inside nestled a ring of simple design, a gold band with a single pearl. "My mother's," he explained. "Father saved it for when I found someone to love." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Emma felt the weight of history and promise. It represented not just James's family legacy, but the future they would build together, bridging worlds and limitations that others considered defining. When Clara opened the door, having watched through the window with poorly disguised interest, her eyes immediately went to the ring. "Well," she said, a smile warming her face, "it seems congratulations are in order." News of their engagement spread through Pine Ridge with remarkable speed. By the following morning, Margaret greeted Emma with an enthusiastic hug when she arrived at the shop. "I knew it. I told Mrs. Reynolds just last week that you two would make it official before summer's end." Emma smiled, her hands moving in the signs Margaret had learned. "We haven't set a date yet." "Well, whenever it is, you'll need a proper wedding dress, and don't think of paying for it. Consider it my gift." Throughout the day, customers offered congratulations with varying degrees of sincerity. Some were genuinely pleased, others clearly still processing the unusual match. Mrs. Baker, the banker's wife, paused while collecting her new blue silk gown. "I admit I didn't understand at first," she said carefully, "but watching you two at the dance, there's something special in how you communicate, something many married couples never achieve despite having all their faculties." Emma nodded, grateful for the woman's honesty and growing acceptance. Not everyone was supportive. Harold Barton's wife entered the shop with barely concealed disdain, requesting alterations to a dress while pointedly avoiding Emma's assistance. The Reverend's wife made a comment within Emma's hearing about the Lord's mysterious ways in matching the afflicted. But these voices were increasingly in the minority. Something had shifted in Pine Ridge's perception, a widening of possibilities for what constituted a worthy life and partnership. 3 days after the spring festival, James arrived at the shop near closing time. His expression was unusually serious as he waited for Margaret to step into the back room before approaching Emma. "We need to talk," he signed. "Can you come to the ranch this Sunday?" Concern fluttered in Emma's chest. "Is something wrong?" James hesitated. "Not wrong, important, about our future." Throughout the week, Emma's mind conjured various scenarios. Had James reconsidered their engagement? Was there some aspect of ranch life he feared she couldn't adapt to? By Sunday morning, her nerves were stretched tight as she waited for Samuel Owens to collect her in the wagon. To her surprise, James himself arrived, looking exceptionally handsome in clean work clothes, his expression a mixture of nervousness and excitement. The ride to the ranch passed in companionable silence, though Emma noticed James casting frequent glances her way, as if reassuring himself of her presence. When they arrived, another surprise awaited. The Owens family was there, along with Margaret and Clara, all wearing their Sunday best. "What's happening?" Emma signed to James, confusion evident in her face. He took her hands in his. "I realized something after the spring festival. We don't need to wait or plan an elaborate wedding if you're certain, if you're ready." Understanding dawned slowly. "Today?" she signed, her eyes widening. James nodded. "Reverend Miller is waiting inside, but only if you want this. We can wait if you prefer a proper ceremony in town." Emma glanced at the assembled friends, their faces bearing expressions of happy anticipation. Clara had brought a small valise, presumably containing Emma's things, indicating her collaboration in this surprise. For a moment, Emma considered all that a traditional wedding would entail: the preparations, the church ceremony, the unavoidable whispers and stares from those in town who still viewed their union with skepticism. Then she looked at James's face, open, honest, loving, and the home he had built, ready to share with her. "No waiting," she signed decisively. "Today is perfect." Relief and joy transformed James's features. He gestured toward the house, but before they could move, Emma held up one finger, asking him to wait. She turned to Clara. "Could I have a few minutes to prepare?" she asked in her raspy voice, wanting this moment to be special despite its spontaneity. Clara beamed. "Of course, dear. Margaret and I brought everything you might need. Come along." In the guest bedroom, Emma found a simple but beautiful white dress laid out on the bed, not the elaborate wedding gown Margaret had mentioned creating, but a lovely alternative clearly made with care over the past week. "We guessed your measurements, and from the dresses you've altered," Margaret explained as she helped Emma change. "James approached me the day after the spring festival with this plan. Said he didn't want to wait, didn't see the point in elaborate ceremonies when what mattered was building your life together." Clara arranged Emma's hair with wildflowers James had gathered that morning. "That man adores you," she said, meeting Emma's eyes in the small mirror. "You know that, don't you?" Emma nodded, emotion tightening her throat. "It won't be easy," Clara continued. "No marriage is, but you two understand struggle in ways most couples never will. That's a strength, not a weakness." When they emerged from the bedroom, the main room had been transformed. Fresh-cut wildflowers adorned every surface, and the afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the small gathering. Reverend Miller stood before the fireplace, his Bible open in his hands, and there was James, waiting by the hearth, his expression transforming as Emma appeared. The naked adoration in his eyes would have brought her to tears if she hadn't been so filled with joy. The ceremony was brief and unconventional. James had written his vows, which he handed to Reverend Miller to read aloud while simultaneously assigning the words to Emma. "I promise to build a life of equal partnership where our differences complement rather than divide us. I promise to see your silence not as an absence, but as a space where understanding deepens. I promise to face the world's judgment with you, never forgetting that what others perceive as our greatest weaknesses have led to our greatest strength, each other." Emma's vows were signed directly to James, with Clara softly voicing the translation for the others. "I promise to be your ears when needed, your voice when wanted, but never to define you by what you cannot hear or me by what I cannot say. I promise to create a home where communication flows, not from lips and ears alone, but from heart to heart. I promise to stand beside you in dignity and determination, grateful each day for the silence that brought us together." When Reverend Miller pronounced them husband and wife, James took Emma's face gently between his hands, his eyes conveying devotion words could never adequately express. Their kiss was both a seal upon their vows and a declaration to the world. They had found in each other's so-called limitations a freedom most would never know. The small celebration afterward was filled with laughter and conversation, flowing in multiple forms: spoken words, signed exchanges, written notes, and the universal language of smiles and embraces. Mrs. Owens had prepared a feast, and Samuel produced a fiddle, playing lively tunes while his father attempted to teach James and Emma a folk dance that dissolved into good-natured laughter. As twilight settled over the ranch, the guests departed with hugs and well wishes, leaving the newlyweds alone in what was now their shared home. The reality of the day's events seemed to settle over them both as the door closed behind Clara, the last to leave. "Wife," James signed, the word carrying wonder. "Husband," Emma replied, equally amazed by the transformation a few hours had wrought. He took her hands, his expression growing serious. "Are you happy with this, our small wedding, this modest house?" Emma looked around at the ranch house that had so impressed her on first visit, the bookshelves filled with worlds of knowledge, the leather-working bench speaking to James's precision and patience, the solid walls built by generations of Cooper men. Then she looked at James himself, the man who had seen her silence not as a barrier, but as a kindred spirit to his own silent world. "This isn't a modest house," she signed, her movements eloquent with emotion. "It's the richest home I've ever known." Later that night, as they stood on the porch watching the stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky, James wrapped his arms around Emma from behind, his chin resting on her head. In the distance, coyotes called to each other across the darkened hills. Sounds she could hear, but he could only imagine. Yet they stood in the same moment, under the same stars, their hearts beating to rhythms neither could actually hear, but both could feel. Different perceptions of the same world. Complementary, rather, than divisive. Emma turned in his embrace to face him, her hands rising between them to sign words no one else would witness. "In Philadelphia, I was defined by what I'd lost. Here, with you, I'm defined by what I've found. James's answering smile held the promise of all their tomorrows, days built not on perfect hearing or perfect speech, but on perfect understanding. They had found in each other's silence the most eloquent language of all, acceptance without condition, love without reservation, and the quiet miracle of being truly seen. In a world that valued noise and conformity, they had created a sanctuary of meaningful silence and authentic connection, proving that sometimes the most powerful expressions of love require no sound at all. The autumn sun cast a golden glow across the expanded Cooper Ranch as Emma stood on the porch watching her husband demonstrate proper roping technique to their eager ranch hands. In 3 years, their property had nearly tripled in size, not because they needed more land, but because Harold Barton's failed attempt to ruin them had backfired spectacularly. After the Spring Festival confrontation, Harold had tried to turn the town against them through whisper campaigns and business interference. But George Montgomery, before returning east, had arranged for Emma's inheritance to be properly invested, including purchasing the struggling ranch adjacent to James's property when its owner decided to return east. With expanded acreage came opportunities. James's innovative cattle breeding techniques, once dismissed as a deaf man's odd notions, proved remarkably successful. The Cooper Shorthorn became known throughout Wyoming Territory for its hardiness and quality. Meanwhile, Emma had transformed the abandoned ranch house on their new property into a small but thriving seamstress school, where she taught young women the fine needlework skills she'd brought from Philadelphia. The sound of a child's laughter drew Emma's attention to the garden, where 4-year-old Ruth Owens was teaching 2-year-old Thomas Cooper the signs for different flowers. Thomas's dark hair and blue eyes mirrored his father's, while his determined spirit reflected both his parents. Thomas had been born with perfect hearing, a fact confirmed by the doctor's tests and his startled reaction to a dropped pan in his earliest days. Yet he lived in a household where silent communication flowed as naturally as spoken words. By his first birthday, his tiny hands were already forming simple signs, even as his vocal vocabulary developed normally. Samuel Owens, now the ranch foreman at 22, rode toward the barn, tipping his hat to Emma as he passed. His mother followed behind in a wagon filled with preserves and fresh bread. Ruth Owens had appointed herself unofficial grandmother to Thomas and made the journey from their homestead twice weekly with provisions and doting affection. "The men are working up appetites out there," Ruth called as she pulled the wagon to a stop. "Thought we might need extra for supper." Emma smiled and signed her thanks, her voice reserved for situations that truly required it. Over the years, her raspy whisper had strengthened somewhat, though it would never return to its former clarity. But this no longer bothered her. In the world she and James had built, multiple forms of communication existed side by side, each valued for its purpose. "How's the planning coming for the school expansion?" Ruth asked, climbing down from the wagon. Emma signed her response, which Ruth had become quite proficient at understanding. "The new wing should be finished before the first snow. We already have 5 students confirmed for spring term." The seamstress school had begun with just 2 local girls seeking to learn a trade. Now young women from as far as Cheyenne sought Emma's instruction, some staying in the converted bunkhouse during their months of training. The marriage of traditional Eastern techniques with practical frontier adaptations had created a unique curriculum that yielded graduates whose work was increasingly sought after throughout the territory. "And Harold Barton's girl is still among them?" Ruth raised an eyebrow in surprise. Emma nodded. Rebecca Barton, Harold's 19-year-old daughter, had approached Emma after church 6 months earlier. Her request to join the school, delivered in halting but determined sign language she had taught herself in secret, had stunned Emma. "Rebecca has genuine talent," Emma signed. Her father still doesn't know she's enrolled for spring. Harold had maintained his opposition to the Cooper family's growing influence in Pine Ridge, though his proposed asylum had been permanently shelved after the town council unanimously rejected it. His mercantile business had suffered when the railroad finally reached Pine Ridge last year, bringing competition he hadn't anticipated. Inside the main house, now expanded with 2 additional rooms, Emma and Ruth prepared supper, while Thomas helped by arranging napkins with serious concentration. The child moved between the silent and speaking worlds with the fluid adaptability of youth, addressing his mother in sign while speaking aloud to visitors who didn't understand their hand language. The sound of boots on the porch announced the men's return. James entered first, his face lighting up at the sight of his family. Thomas ran to him with arms outstretched, and James swept him up in a fluid motion, the boy's giggles filling the room as his father spun him around. "Pa, look!" Thomas exclaimed, then switched seamlessly to signing, "I put napkins on the table all by myself." James's expression of exaggerated amazement made the child beam with pride. He set Thomas down and crossed to Emma, placing a gentle kiss on her forehead. Their standard greeting unchanged since their first days of marriage. The evening meal had become something of a community gathering. Samuel and Ruth Owens were regular presences, and tonight they were joined by Margaret, who at 70 had finally retired from her shop in town, selling the business to one of Emma's first graduates. Even Clara visited once a month, bringing news from the boarding house she still ran with increasing help from her niece. Conversation flowed in multiple streams, spoken words, signed exchanges, notes passed for more complex topics. The boundaries between these forms had blurred over time, creating a hybrid language unique to their expanding circle. Several ranch hands had learned basic signs, finding them useful for communicating across noisy pastures or during roundups when voices couldn't carry. After the meal, as dusk painted the mountains in deepening shadows, Samuel pulled out his fiddle. The vibrations of the instrument against the wooden floorboards allowed James to feel the rhythm, if not the melody. He took Emma's hand, leading her into the familiar steps of their evening dance, a tradition they'd maintained since their wedding night. Thomas watched from his perch on Ruth's lap, clapping in time to music only some of them could hear, but all could appreciate in their own way. Later, after their guests had departed and Thomas was tucked into bed with a story signed by his father, Emma and James sat on the porch swing, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "Did you ever imagine this life?" James signed, his gestures illuminated by the lantern hanging from the porch beam. Emma smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Never. When I stepped off that train, I thought I was at the end of my journey, not the beginning." James's arm tightened around her. "Sometimes I still can't believe Harold's rejection led you to me, his greatest gift." Emma signed with a hint of mischief in her expression. "Don't tell him that. His pride couldn't bear it." The mention of Harold reminded Emma of news Clara had shared during dinner. "Did Clara tell you Harold's planning to sell the mercantile and move to Denver?" James nodded. "Samuel heard it from the blacksmith yesterday. Apparently, he's been offered a partnership in his brother's business." "I hope he finds peace there," Emma signed, surprising even herself with the sincerity of the sentiment. "I hope he finds peace there," Emma signed, surprising even herself with the sincerity of the sentiment. "You're too forgiving," James responded, though his expression held admiration rather than criticism. Not forgiveness, understanding. His limitations were far greater than ours. This philosophy had guided their approach to the community over the years. Rather than retreat into isolation or fight against persistent prejudice, they had simply lived their truth openly. Running a successful ranch, raising a bilingual son, creating opportunities for others. Their most effective response to judgment had been quiet excellence. As if reading her thoughts, James signed, "Mayor Thompson approached me after church yesterday. They want me to consider joining the town council next term." Emma's eyebrows rose in surprise. From outcast to council member in 3 years was a remarkable transformation. "What did you tell him?" she asked. "That I'd discuss it with my wife," James replied with a smile. "The meetings would require an interpreter." "I think you should accept," Emma signed decisively. "Your perspective is valuable, and it would continue what we started at the Spring Festival, showing that different doesn't mean less." The legacy of that confrontation had rippled through Pine Ridge in unexpected ways. The new schoolhouse now included specific provisions for teaching children with various challenges. The church had designated a front pew for those who needed to see the minister's lips more clearly. Small accommodations had begun appearing throughout, not from pity, but from recognition that community meant including everyone. From the nursery came a small cry. Thomas, likely woken by a dream, called for his parents. Both rose in unison, accustomed to sharing all aspects of parenthood equally. As they entered their son's room, Thomas raised his small hands, signing sleepily, "Bad dream." James sat on the edge of the bed while Emma smoothed back the child's dark curls. Thomas's ability to communicate his needs in multiple ways, a fusion of his parents' worlds, struck Emma anew as a profound gift rather than a compromise. "What was your dream about?" James signed. "People couldn't talk to each other," Thomas signed back, his expression serious. "Nobody understood." Emma and James exchanged a glance over their son's head, a look that contained shared history, understanding, and gentle amusement at the irony of his fear. "That is scary," Emma acknowledged, "but remember what we always tell you?" Thomas's hands formed the familiar response. "Real listening happens with more than ears." "And real speaking with more than voice," James added, completing their family mantra. As Thomas drifted back to sleep between them, Emma contemplated the journey that had led to this moment, from a mail-order bride rejected for being too quiet to a woman who had found strength in silence and voice in understanding. From a deaf rancher isolated by others' limitations to a respected community member, whose differences were increasingly seen as valuable perspectives. Their love story hadn't followed any conventional path. It had been written in the spaces between words, in gestures visible and invisible, in challenges overcome together. What Harold Barton and others had seen as insurmountable barriers had become the very foundation of their extraordinary connection. Outside their window, the vast Wyoming sky stretched endlessly above their expanding ranch, a fitting backdrop for two people who had refused to accept the boundaries others tried to place around them. In finding each other, they hadn't merely overcome their individual limitations. They had redefined what it meant to truly communicate, proving that sometimes the deepest connections form not despite our differences, but because of them. The newly constructed Pine Ridge Town Hall gleamed in the summer sunshine, its fresh paint and polished windows a testament to the prosperity that had transformed the once humble frontier settlement into a thriving community. Flags and bunting decorated the building for the day's momentous occasion, the 10th anniversary of the railroad's arrival and the official incorporation of Pine Ridge as a proper city. Emma Cooper adjusted the collar of 12-year-old Thomas's suit as they waited outside the hall. At 38, Emma's chestnut hair now contained threads of silver at the temples, but her posture remained straight, her eyes clear and observant. As ever, beside her, 8-year-old Elizabeth Cooper fidgeted impatiently, her father's blue eyes scanning the growing crowd for friends. Beside her, 8-year-old Elizabeth Cooper fidgeted impatiently, her father's blue eyes scanning the growing crowd for friends. "Stand still, young lady," Emma said in her seldom-used voice, strengthened by years of carefully practiced exercises, but still carrying its distinctive raspy quality. Elizabeth signed her response with the fluid speed of a native signer. "But Pa's going to speak soon. I want to get a good spot." "Your father won't start without us," Thomas signed back, his movements elegant and precise, reflecting both his mother's refinement and his father's meticulous nature. A decade of marriage had brought Emma not just these two remarkable children, but a life richer than anything she could have imagined when she first stepped off the train in Pine Ridge. Their ranch had grown into one of the most prosperous in the region, known for innovative breeding techniques and sustainable grazing, practices that other ranchers traveled miles to observe. The seamstress school had evolved into the Cooper Institute for Practical Arts, a respected vocational school for young women that taught not only sewing and design, but also business management, basic accounting, and communication skills. Graduates from the institute could be found running successful businesses throughout Wyoming Territory and beyond. "Mrs. Cooper," a cheerful voice called from across the street. Rebecca Barton, now Rebecca Miller after her marriage to the railroad station master's son, hurried toward them, her own young daughter in tow. At 29, Rebecca had become one of the Institute's most successful graduates, running a thriving dressmaking shop in Cheyenne that specialized in adaptive clothing for people with various physical challenges. "I wouldn't have missed this for anything," Rebecca said, embracing Emma warmly. "Father sends his regards as well." This news surprised Emma. Harold Barton had indeed moved to Denver years ago, his relationship with his daughter strained by her choice to study under the woman he had once rejected and ridiculed. That he would acknowledge today's ceremony, even indirectly, suggested a softening in his rigid worldview. Rebecca switched to signing as she addressed all three Coopers. "He's following the newspaper reports about Father's appointment. I think he's finally beginning to understand." James's appointment to the Wyoming Territorial Commission on Education had sent ripples throughout the region. Never before had a deaf man held such a position of authority. His mandate to develop standards ensuring all children, regardless of physical or sensory challenges, received appropriate education had begun to change how schools throughout the territory operated. The appointment had come after years of steady community involvement. James had indeed joined the Pine Ridge Town Council 8 years ago, with Emma serving as his interpreter. His practical wisdom and innovative problem-solving gradually won over even his staunchest critics. When the territorial governor visited Pine Ridge 2 years ago and witnessed the thriving community where signed and spoken language coexisted seamlessly, he had been inspired to create the new commission. The town hall doors opened and people began filing inside. The Cooper family made their way to the front row, reserved for the speakers and their families. Elizabeth bounced excitedly on her toes, while Thomas maintained the dignified composure that sometimes made him seem older than his 12 years. The interior of the hall hummed with conversation as townsfolk found their seats. Many exchanged greetings with the Cooper family in sign, a language that had spread throughout Pine Ridge over the years, taught in the school and used in many businesses. What had once marked James and Emma as outsiders had transformed into a community asset, bridging communication gaps in noisy sawmills, across ranch pastures, and during church socials, where music often drowned out spoken words. Mayor Reynolds, formerly Mrs. Reynolds of the cafe, took the podium. She had been one of the first town officials to learn basic signs, recognizing their practical value beyond accommodating a single deaf resident. "Welcome, citizens of Pine Ridge," she began, her hands simultaneously forming the signs, a practice now common in all official town functions. "Today we celebrate not just our official incorporation as a city, but the spirit that has defined our community's growth." Emma felt a hand on her shoulder, and turned to see Clara Jenkins, now approaching, 80 but still sharp as ever. The former boarding house owner had sold her business 5 years ago, but remained an active community member and honorary grandmother to the Cooper children. "He looks handsome up there," Clara whispered, nodding toward the side of the stage, where James waited with the other speakers. At 45, James Cooper cut an impressive figure. His once brown hair now showed distinguished gray at the temples, and years of ranch work had weathered his face, but his posture remained straight, his gaze confident. The awkward isolation that had once surrounded him like an invisible barrier had long since dissolved, replaced by the assured presence of a man who knew his worth and contribution. He caught Emma's eye across the room and signed quickly. "Nervous?" She signed back, "You'll be wonderful, just like always." Their exchange, brief but intimate, reflected the deep connection that had only strengthened over their years together. They had developed a private language within the language of signs, shorthand expressions, and inside references that communicated volumes in a single gesture. After the mayor's introduction and a speech from the railroad representative, James took the podium. The hall fell silent, a gesture of respect rather than necessity, as he would be signing his speech while Professor Lawrence from the Territorial College provided voice interpretation. 10 years ago, James began, his signs clear and measured. Many believed Pine Ridge would remain a small frontier outpost, unchanging and isolated. Some saw this as preservation of tradition. Others recognized it as stagnation. Professor Lawrence's voice carried James's words throughout the hall as he continued. The arrival of the railroad brought physical connection to the wider world, but the true transformation of Pine Ridge came from another kind of connection, the recognition that diversity of experience strengthens rather than weakens a community. From her seat in the front row, Emma felt a surge of pride. The man before them spoke with the confidence of someone who had found his voice in a world that had once tried to silence him. The audience, many of whom had initially dismissed him as the deaf rancher, now leaned forward, captivated by his insights. "My journey in Pine Ridge began in isolation," James signed. "Like many who are different, I existed at the margins of community life, not through active rejection, but through the passive barriers of misunderstanding." He paused, his gaze finding Emma's. Then a mail-order bride arrived, rejected for being too quiet. In finding each other, we discovered that our so-called limitations were actually foundations for a deeper understanding. The hall remained silent as James recounted their story, not as a personal anecdote, but as a metaphor for the community's evolution. He spoke of initial resistance, the confrontation at the spring festival, and the gradual shift as practical solutions replaced prejudice. Today, Pine Ridge stands as a model for inclusive community development, he continued. Our school teaches all children, regardless of their hearing, speaking, or physical capabilities. Our businesses employ communication methods that enhance efficiency for everyone. Our public events ensure all citizens can participate fully. Thomas leaned against Emma's side, watching his father with undisguised admiration. Unlike his sister Elizabeth, Thomas had inherited his father's artistic talent, showing remarkable promise in leatherwork despite his young age. The Territorial Commission I now serve on will use Pine Ridge's experience to develop guidelines for schools throughout Wyoming, James signed, not as special accommodation, but as recognition that human diversity requires diverse approaches to communication and education. As James's speech concluded to enthusiastic applause, both hand-waved and conventional, Emma reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The mail-order bride arrangement that had originally brought her west had failed in its intended purpose, but succeeded beyond imagination in an entirely different way. After the ceremony, the town square filled with celebrants enjoying the community picnic. Tables groaned with food, a band played on the gazebo platform, and children raced through the summer green grass. The Cooper family moved through the crowd, greeting friends and accepting congratulations on James's speech. "Mrs. Cooper," a voice Emma hadn't heard in many years called. She turned to find an elderly man with a cane making his way toward her. "Mr. Montgomery," she exclaimed, genuinely pleased. What a surprise. The Boston businessman had maintained occasional correspondence with Emma over the years, but she hadn't expected him to travel so far at his advanced age. "I wouldn't have missed this," he said, his eyes twinkling. "When I read about James's appointment in the Eastern papers, I knew I had to see for myself what you two have accomplished here." He glanced around at the integrated community where signed conversation occurred alongside spoken dialogue, where the Cooper children moved effortlessly between these worlds, where differences had become ordinary rather than exceptional. "I owe you an apology," Montgomery said soberly. "When I came to bring you back to Philadelphia, I couldn't imagine this was possible. I thought you were sacrificing yourself to isolation." Emma smiled gently. "You wanted what you thought was best for me, but I had found something precious here, the freedom to define myself beyond my limitations." Montgomery nodded thoughtfully. "I see that now, and not just for you and James, but for this entire community. You've created something remarkable." As the afternoon progressed, Emma found herself drawn to the quieter edges of the celebration. She watched Elizabeth playing an elaborate game with other children, some deaf, some hearing, all communicating through a mixture of signs, words, and the universal language of play. Nearby, Thomas sat with a group of his friends from school, their hands flying in conversation, despite the fact that all could hear perfectly well. They had grown up with signing as a natural part of their world and used it instinctively when talking became impractical due to distance or noise. James found her there, offering a glass of lemonade as he sat beside her on a bench beneath an oak tree. "Proud of you today," she signed, her fingers expressing what words alone could not convey. "Proud of us," he corrected. "Everything here grew from what we built together." Emma watched a newcomer to town, a young woman with a visible limb difference, being warmly welcomed into a circle of institute graduates. The woman's face reflected surprise and relief at the matter-of-fact inclusion. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been," Emma signed, "if Harold had accepted me that first day at the station?" James's expression turned thoughtful. "Sometimes. But then I remember what you taught me. That rejection often redirects us to where we truly belong." The wisdom in his observations struck Emma anew. Harold's rejection had seemed devastating at the time, but it had set in motion a journey that transformed not just her life, but an entire community's understanding of difference and capability. As the sun began its slow descent toward the western mountains, casting golden light across the celebration, James touched Emma's hand to draw her attention to the far side of the square. There, unnoticed by most in the crowd, stood an elderly man watching the proceedings with undisguised curiosity. Harold Barton, coming back to Pine Ridge after all these years. He caught their gaze, hesitated, then inclined his head in a gesture that fell somewhere between acknowledgement and apology. James, without hesitation, returned the nod with dignified grace. Emma added a small smile, recognizing in Harold's presence a completion of the circle that had begun at the train station 15 years ago. The former merchant didn't approach them, but continued observing the community that had evolved in his absence, a living testament to possibilities he had once dismissed. After a few minutes, he turned and walked slowly toward the new hotel on Main Street, his back straight despite his advanced years. Not everyone can change their perception, James signed as they watched Harold's departure. "But we can change what they perceive," Emma replied, gesturing toward the thriving, integrated celebration around them. "Reality speaks louder than prejudice given enough time." As twilight deepened into evening, lanterns were lit around the square. The Owens family, Samuel now married with children of his own, Ruth, still spry despite her 70 years, joined the Coopers for the traditional dance that concluded every Pine Ridge celebration. When the fiddler struck up a waltz, James extended his hand to Emma, just as he had at their first spring festival. She took it with the same certainty she had felt then, though now their movements were smoothed by years of dancing together, anticipating each other's rhythm without thought. Their children joined the dance, Elizabeth with the banker's grandson, Thomas with Rebecca Miller's daughter. All of them moving to music that some could hear and others could only feel through vibration and visual cues. Around them, the citizens of Pine Ridge danced together in various combinations, the differences between them no longer barriers, but simply variations in the human experience. As James guided her through a turn, Emma caught sight of their reflection in the town hall windows, no longer the anxious mail-order bride and isolated deaf rancher, but partners who had built something extraordinary from rejection and limitation. They had arrived at this moment not by denying their differences, but by embracing them, not by overcoming silence, but by discovering its value. The sky above Pine Ridge filled with stars as the celebration continued into the night, each point of light distinct yet part of the same vast pattern. In the square below, a community celebrated not just its official recognition as a city, but its evolution into a place where communication flowed in multiple forms, where capability was recognized in diverse expressions, and where two people, once defined by what they lacked, had redefined what it meant to be complete. In the end, the mail-order bride rejected for being too quiet, and the deaf rancher who saw beauty in her silence had created not just a marriage or a family, but a legacy of understanding that would echo far beyond Wyoming Territory, a testament to the unexpected gifts that come when rejection leads us not to bitterness, but to the place where we truly belong. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.